Hello everybody. In this tutorial, we are going to go over the basics of using functions in Python. Specifically, we will cover examples for a function that takes no arguments and has no return values, a function that takes one argument, a function that takes one argument and returns one value, a function that adds two numbers together, a function that takes a variable number of arguments, a function that returns multiple values, as in returning a tuple, a function that uses a variable outside of the function. We will consider the variable scope in this example, and a function with default and or optional parameters. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, for our first example, let's create a function that says hello. To create a function, you start out by typing def, and then you want to give your function a name. We'll just name this function hello. And if your function takes input parameters or arguments, then you would put those in parentheses. But this function will take no arguments, so we're going to leave that blank. And then we need to put a colon, hit enter, and then you want to tell the function what to do. In this case, we're simply going to display a message that says hello when this function is called. So let's use a print to display hello. Okay, now if we run this, you're going to see that nothing happens yet. So in order to use this function, we need to call it. So let's go over to our console and let's put in hello with the parentheses. And all we have to do is simply hit return, and this will call the function, and whatever is in the body of the function will be executed. And you can see it says hello. For our next example, let's create a function similar to the function we just created. However, in this case, instead of just saying hello, let's make the function say hello to a specific person. So we'll type def, and let's call this function hello2, and this will take an argument with the name that we're going to say hello to. And again, let's just make this function display a message that says hello to the name that we put in as an argument once we call the function. So let's use a print, and let's just type hello. Let's put in curly bracket placeholders for that name, use the format, and then we'll put the name in the format. So this name will go into these curly brackets, and that will depend on the name that we pass into the function when we call it. So let's go ahead and try this out. First, let's run this, and then let's go ahead and call it. So let's call hello2. Let's pass in a name of Roberto. Hit enter, and this should now print hello Roberto. And it does. We're good to go. For our next example, let's create a function that takes one argument and returns one value. Type def. Let's give our function a name. Let's call this return1. And this will take one argument. We'll call that number. And then we type return. And what do we want to return? In this case, let's return the number to the power of 2. So let's go ahead and run our code, and then let's call this function. Now let's go ahead and put in our argument, and let's just put in the number 5. So what this is doing is we're calling the function return1. That's the name we gave this function. We're passing in one argument, which is the number, and then this is going to return that number to the power of 2. So this should return 25. Let's go ahead and hit enter, and it returns 25. We're good to go. Next up, let's create an example of a function that takes in two arguments and then adds them together. Declare our function def, and let's give it the name of add numbers. And it's going to take in two arguments. Let's just call that A and B. Put your colon, and now let's just simply return A plus b. So let's run our code and call the function add numbers. Now we need to put in the numbers that we want to add together, and let's just put in 70 and 30, and we get 100. Good. Next up, let's create a function that takes in a variable number of arguments. To do that, type out def. Let's give our function a name, and we'll name this sumAll. And to allow for a variable number of arguments, we put in a star, and let's just call these arguments numbers. Put our colon, and then we want to, in this case, return the sum of all of these numbers that we put into the function when we call it. So let's just type sum numbers. And let's do one more thing to this number that we return. So let's just assume that we work for a company and we only get 80% of our sales. So these numbers that we pass in as arguments to this function, we will assume are sales, and we only get 80% of that at the end. So let's multiply this by 0.8. So let's run our code, call the function sumAll, and in this case, let's just put in 10 items sold at $100. So let's put in 100. There's 3, 6. Let's count that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. So what this should do now is sum all of these numbers that we put into the function and then multiply it by 0.8. Let's go ahead and hit return and see what we get. And we get 800. And that's what we should expect, because we know 10 times 100 is 1,000, and 0.8, or 80% of that, is 800. So just remember that when you want to put in a varying number or a variable number of arguments, you can use this star. Okay? For our next example, let's create a function that returns multiple values. And you will sometimes hear this referred to as returning a tuple. For this function, we want to take in a variable number of numbers and then return the count of the evens and odds. So let's go ahead and type this code out, and then once it's all typed out, we'll go over it and explain it. Okay, so now let's go over this code. We created our function. We gave it the name of evens odds. It will be allowed to accept a varying number of arguments. We created a starting point for the count for the evens and the odds. Set that to 0. Then we created a for loop to iterate through all of the arguments that we will pass into the function. Then, if any of those arguments or numbers are even, then add that to the count for the even variable. And if any of those arguments or numbers are odd, then add that to the count for the odd variable. And then finally return the count for the evens and the odds. Or as we mentioned earlier, return the tuple. So let's go ahead and run this code and then call the function. Evens, odds. Now let's put in 2 evens and 3 odds. So we should get back a count of 2 and 3, and we do. Now let's try it again. And let's put in 1 even and 7 odds. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so we have 1 even and 7 odds. So now this should return 1, 7. Okay, we're good to go. It looks like our function is working properly, and that is just one example of how you can return multiple values from a function or return a tuple. Next up, let's create a function that uses a variable that is outside of the function. So let's go ahead and create our variable pi, 3.14. Now let's define our function. We'll just call this outside. And this is going to take two arguments, x and y. And then we're going to create another variable that adds x and y and pi all together. And finally, let's return z, which is the sum of x plus y plus pi. Let's go ahead and run this and call the outside function. Let's put in our two arguments, and let's just put in 5 and 5 and hit return, and we get 13.14. So you can see what this is doing is it's adding x plus y, and then it's going outside of the function, taking pi and adding that as well. Okay, so that's just an example of a function that uses a variable that's outside of the function. For our last example, let's create a function with default or optional parameters. Let's call this function subtract. And this function can take three arguments called a, b, and let's set this b to a default of 20 and c, and let's set that to a default of 0. Now let's create a variable output, and this will take a minus b minus c. And then finally we're going to return the output. Let's run our code, call the function subtract, and since we have b set to 20 as a default and c set to 0 as a default, these become optional. So all you have to do is put in one value. Let's just put in 40 and see what this does. So we get an answer or an output of 20. So what's happening is this is taking 40 minus the default 20 minus the default 0. So it's just 40 minus 20, which gives us 20. Now if you want to, I guess you could say, override those defaults, you can do that. So let's go ahead and call the function again. And let's put in 100. Now let's put in 20, and let's put in 10. Okay, so in a sense, actually, let's change this 20 to something that's different than the original default. Let's put in 40. Now let's hit return, and we get 50. So what this is doing is it's setting the a argument to 100, and it's subtracting 40 and then subtracting 10, which gives us 50. Okay, so when you set your parameters with defaults and you don't put in the arguments when you call the function, they will default to whatever number you have put in. But if you want to override those, in a sense, you can do that like we did in this example here. Okay, so that is it for our tutorial on the basics of Python functions. We will be doing many more Python tutorials in the near future. Please join us for those, and we'll see you next time.